I am going to turn it over to our student in the class, Sanaya, who will give a longer sort of introduction, but we're very happy to have you here today, and we hope you enjoyed this event.
I'm Sanaya Lee. I'm a fourth-year English major, and I'm happy to have this opportunity to introduce this evening's guest speaker, Eddie On. So Eddie On has been an environmental justice attorney and nonprofit worker for 15 years. While working as the executive director of Brightline Defense, a San Francisco-based clean energy, San Francisco-based environmental justice nonprofit, he was inducted into the state of California's Clean Energy Hall of Fame for his work in equity and clean energy. In addition to his nonprofit work, he was served as the president of the San Francisco Commission on the Environment, as well as the commissioner of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and Bay Conservation and Development Commission. He's a self-taught artist who has been recognized as a cartoonist in residence by the Charles M. Schulz Museum in Santa Rosa. We are thrilled to host Eddie at USF today. So everyone, please help me welcome Eddie On.
Thanks for coming out tonight. I want to first of all introduce Brian Hibbs, the owner of Comics Experience, which is an amazing comic book store in the Visadero. Brian, tell us the situation with the comic books. What's going on here?
Yeah, I mean we've got Eddie's book here, which is fantastic. If you want to, you'll watch his presentation. If you want to buy a book, we're happy to sell it. We've also got some stickers and some postcards and stuff. Eddie was a member, not a member, well, he is a member of our graphic novel club, but he was also a guest of the graphic novel club. Every month, Comics Experience, we pick 2 new books, one aimed at adults, one aimed at kids, and the whole staff votes on it, so that we actually make sure that it's the best thing and not just what an old 50-year-old guy says. And we do, it comes with a signed book plate for the Graphic Novel Club members, and we do a live interview that's live streamed on YouTube. So if you're interested in the medium of comics and you're not quite sure what to do, I think it's a really great way to find out more about comics and more about what's going on there. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about it, Eddie.
Some other fun stuff we got going on for you today. Merha, a former USF student and one of Brightline's current day employees, has brought in a box of shirts. You should all enjoy. Merha, did you get your business cards too today by chance? Yes. So we managed to get business cards made for Merha, and also Jacob is someone else I want to introduce, who's a former USF student as well, also a current day Brightline employee. If you're interested in Brightline's work after I describe it, grab business cards from them and feel free to chat with them. Hopefully I'm not a horrible, supervisor or anything like that, but you can vouch for the quality of the work itself and what they do what we do across the Bay Area. So, when I start out giving these talks, I try to center it around, essentially to map out for you today's presentation, like a 20, 30-minute chat. I'll try to gauge if your interest is flagging as we give this presentation, and then we'll just transition into Q&A, because I'm really interested always with each audience, how they interact with this material. It's been also a learning experience for me just to understand how, in some ways, information can or cannot be sticky. So I always enjoy these presentations, and thanks to Professor Johnson, Gloria Simmons, for even thinking of us to begin with. Professor Zarabel took off, right? But in many ways, their brainchild in the Thacher Gallery for hosting me in this way. Many of you already saw how that art is set up with multiple artists. But to be here, chatting with you about the idea of graphic storytelling and how it connects ideally with, nonprofit work, environmental justice, is a real treasure to me personally. The one thing I want to point out that everybody here can think on is what is not on the cover that I would have loved to be on the cover. And maybe to describe the artistic process itself, and the publisher that it's ended up with, Penguin Random House, it's quite a hard process. One thing to describe is as a first-time author, you actually do not get that much control over what goes on the cover. But to the publisher's credit too, they also worked with me, but there's still one thing I wish was on the cover that's not on the cover that I'm hoping you're going to get. But on the right-hand side, you'll see a panel of myself talking about air quality science. I often give a lot, and Professor Johnson will also attest to this, is I give a lot of talks where prior, to this book coming out without even mentioning the art. So part of it is trying to understand how to tie in, again, my own personal story to how I ended up being in environmental justice work to begin with. And I like starting out with this slide, which shows my grandparents, and particularly my grandfather, who I had, in some ways, like a close childhood relationship with. He died when I was 21. But part of it was thinking through, a lot of these pictures I'm about to show you are translated as illustrations as part of the book. Part of his trajectory in life, and even maybe in some ways his failures, really shaped my family for generations to come. And the book is very intentionally structured as a story looking through a family's rise and fall across, both South Korea and the United States. In this photo, my grandfather served as a translator for between the U.S. and South Korean armies. This is my grandfather and grandmother marrying at the end of the Korean War, 1953. So one of the unique aspects of this photo to notice is the presence of U.S. soldiers even in the background, and how in many ways I think about the parallel path that my grandfather was as a translator, and in some ways it is what I do today. Is essentially an act of translation between different communities, trying to understand community needs, sometimes taking it to policy, sometimes taking it to direct services, which I'll describe more later. But my grandfather himself, as the book describes, was not a successful person, maybe is the gentlest way to put it. He was a failed entrepreneur in many ways. It embittered my mother, you'll learn about in the book. And in many ways, it inspired them to go to the U.S. and build up themselves as what is sometimes the successful immigrant, model minority story that exists in the U.S. So go in, my mother and father, they were going to the University of Texas. That's why I was born in Austin to begin with. My mother was going to become a pharmacist, my dad an engineer. They ended up doing liquor stores instead. And their liquor store, just to emphasize, was not that big goody-goody liquor store. It was actually the CVS liquor store in the left-hand side. So many ways, it was an underdog story, right? It was them, and of course this is a picture of myself cheerfully next to cases of Miller Lite. But their aspirations were to take what they made in the liquor store, invested in my own education, my sister's education, in hopes of us ultimately going to, nice schools. And this is where I often pause to even explain why comics to begin with. Brian Hibbs has often talked about the gutter, which is that white space in between panels. And to emphasize, comics is often not about the art within the panel. It's really how the story moves from panel to panel. Another thing I really like about comics is varying up the panel layout itself and the panel width. If you think about TV or movies, right, it's a fixed aspect ratio, meaning it's just a single kind of aspect ratio you're looking at. The image, cuts in and back and forth on the screen. But here you can vary the panel width for emotional depth or breadth. And then the other thing and then of course this is a double layout page even to begin with. But then you can also center in certain subject matter, which is also relevant when you're trying to tell a story about environmental justice. Throughout the book, there's a number of maps that are featured to give the book a sense of place and then emphasize its importance to the story itself. So part of it was, playing with those elements of graphic storytelling. And then the other thing that I really wanted to focus on was the usage of color to essentially move the time and mood of the story itself. So red, again, growing up in Texas, perhaps illustrating the passions of youth, maybe because it's a Republican state too. In the top right, you'll see, essentially my college pathway, even first job out of college, represented in shades of green. So in many ways, representing perhaps my, freshness out of college and trying to figure out my life career. And then the majority of my adult life has been really spent in California, which is why it's represented in so many different shades. Purple, transitional color unto itself, that mixing of blue and red, as I was trying to figure out, graduating from law school, what I was going to do. Gold, kind of a brief period where Brightline, the nonprofit, seemed to be working out in 2019. And then, there's shades of brown for the pandemic, orange for wildfires, in many ways a really intense time for the organization. Nowadays, blue is a calmer state of mind, essentially, trying to figure out how life isn't perfect right now, but just even trying to figure out how to make the pieces work of the nonprofit has become easier to some degree as well. Here I describe my first kind of job out of college, which was working with elementary students in Oakland, Chinatown. On the bottom right is a note that's even featured in the book itself, which reads, "How come you want to be a lawyer? I want to be a lawyer too, but I can't speak up," is from the student to myself. what I was trying to do at the time was decide whether I want to become a public school teacher versus even a lawyer, and thinking about the types of change that could be represented in each occupation. A teacher can affect a lot of importance in the context of a classroom, 20 to 40 students at a time. In my mind, like a lawyer could also create system level change, like potentially affect whatever it is, thousands or hundreds of thousands at a time. Just because that number is bigger doesn't mean it's better. I often think about quality versus quantity. For me, at the end of the day, and yeah, part of what I was struggling with is like, what is the type of skills I wanted to acquire and the change I wanted to affect it. But I ended up choosing to go to law school. But part of even my struggle with nonprofit work and even struggling to understand how my education could be channeled into further social good was often defined by a family conflict that my mother and I constantly grappled with. So even in those early days of doing the Oakland Chinatown work, I would describe to my mother, this work is important. It's about the community getting an education, hoping she would connect to that because she had invested in my own sister and my own education. But I would also emphasize the family conditions, like, these are parents, who are service workers a lot of the time, and the youth in Chinatown, Oakland Chinatown, didn't have a lot of just generally homework tutorial sessions, extracurricular activities. So there was a lot of value in the work I did as a service worker back then to ideally create better family conditions and educational services for them all. But it always ended with the same question, how much do you get paid? That's all very nice. So part of it was that circular conversation that I wanted to represent in comics. And then there are visual motifs that are revisited in the book too. This idea of bottles, a transactional worldview that often defines what my family's aspirations were, which was, again, go to law school, go work at perhaps a law firm, make a decent amount of money, go, live in a condo, and then at the end of it all, buy a Mercedes-Benz, for the parents. Of course, it's not about the Mercedes-Benz to begin with. It's not about that gesture of just, them having the car to begin with. It was more about conspicuous consumption, perhaps, to use a very academic term. It was also that gesture of love, perhaps, that it represented, and the ascent in American society itself. So part of the visual kind of parallels I wanted to draw was, for instance, that's a hot air balloon ride that my dad took and then ended up being like, a free tchotchke that he would get out of a liquor store, for instance. So part of it was understanding there's a hot air balloon ride, the ascent that it, represented, but the bottom text box says, I'm not quite sure what was supposed to happen next at the end of it all. So a lot of my kind of career pathway, even in law school, was just even trying to figure out what was next. It was thinking through things like, graduating at probably what was the worst time to graduate, 2009. So the 2008 recession was in full swing. I was even trying to figure out, for instance, as a part-time job, playing poker and trying to make ends meet. One thing I want to emphasize is this idea of golden handcuffs, perhaps. It was a story that was shared with me a lot during law school, that you could make, a decent amount of money, with all those aspirations on the left-hand side, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you will be able to do what you want in life. It becomes a handcuffed lifestyle unto itself because you start acquiring things that you have to maintain too. You have to keep up with that, whatever it is, standard of living, cost of living, however you want to emphasize. So there are kind of parallels within the story itself that I try to draw while highlighting that as kind of, values. And, one thing I always tell everyone involved is it's not somehow to make crime, it's not a crime to make money unto itself in our society, because we obviously live in a highly capitalistic society, but part of it is also understanding the trade-offs involved that are with that, right? I hear a lot of talk about, if only I made enough money my first 3 or 4 years after college or whatever, graduate school, then I'll go into social work. But very rarely does it happen that way because of what happens with golden handcuffs. And then, part of it is also thinking through some of the advocacy that was involved even in those early days. So, the bottom panels beneath that golden handcuffs panel shows how I got a law school research grant in 2009, ended up with a nonprofit that I am still at today. And in those early days, it was thinking through what is good advocacy? What constitutes, at the end of the day, good kind of conditions environmental conditions to advocate for the community. So for instance, I remember in those early days, there was a lot of emphasis on like, oh, rooftop solar is not a viable technology because it's so expensive. So you know, or maybe another concept that was pushed forward was this idea of local hiring. So trying to hire locally from the community so that local communities could have equity and economic opportunities that they were normally not afforded when there was economic development going on. And then, you know, part of what I was trying to think through was like how other people would perceive that advocacy in relation to me. So sometimes statement was just like, oh, you're so young, you wouldn't understand what you're talking about. And then on the right-hand side shows a conversation with myself and my father, again, going through perhaps like me trying to re-explain even the idea of environmental nonprofit work to begin with, which was this idea of like, you know, I can advocate for all the solar, it creates potentially jobs, you know, clean energy infrastructure, financial benefits for the community because you save on power. But at the end of it all, again, is that central question, so how much money are you making? And does it have meaning? But I think a lot about Brightline, its trajectory arc. A lot of it's inspired by community figures that are, you know, existing in the communities in which they live. So Dr. Espanola Jackson is someone I often refer to. It's featured on our website as well. So Dr. Jackson, in case you don't know, was a longtime community activist at Bayview Hunters Point. Had been there for decades, had a history that in some ways mirrored the conditions of the neighborhood, how it had its ups and downs. So for instance, was an electrician who came out to work in the naval shipyard that was in Bayview Hunters Point. When it closed down, then the you know, environmental injustices that would occur around Bayview Hunters Point really came to the forefront. And she was at the forefront of a lot of policy struggles that Brightline helped out with, shutting down the peaker power plants that were in Petrolia Hill. Another example would be local hiring, like trying to advocate for mandatory local jobs for particularly Bayview Hunters Point members, like members of a local community that had really high unemployment to begin with. But ideally, like Dr. Jackson would create a next generation of leadership that would be really into the work itself. And this is a photo below of Brightline staff earlier this year, enjoying essentially a celebration of life with Dr. Jackson's family. So Dr. Jackson passed on in 2016, but I'd like to think her legacy would live on. Here you'll start to see some of the visual influences that are also represented, whether it's the power plant or the solar installations that existed. Dr. Jackson herself was very generous with her time at the end of the day. There's no reason why a Korean American kid, you know, from Texas would need to, you know, really talk to a Bayview Hunters Point longtime civil rights leader like Dr. Jackson. But she, you know, in some ways was shrewd in identifying people and that she could use as her own sword. And it, you know, in many ways, like a lot of my earlier learnings were just sitting in her home, just her sharing stories about her life and how she approached the work. That's Brightline's office nowadays in South of Market. And then on the left-hand side is perhaps an institution you might recognize from Van Ness, the California Public Utilities Commission. I want to fast forward perhaps to Brightline's work itself and describe what it is that we exactly do. When I map this out on a board, it's often divided between two areas. One, sometimes I term as direct services. It's what it sounds, the act of providing services directly to the community. So it could be something like citing air quality sensors, or a job training program, or youth leadership programs that exist. But we also do a lot of policy work. It's sometimes what I describe cheerfully as like the act of sitting at a computer, trying to write out whatever it is, public policy reports, regulatory filings. There's a lot of subject matter involved there. So it could be something like building decarbonization, which is a very fancy term for energy efficiency retrofits for, you know, multifamily affordable housing buildings. We also have, you know, offshore wind advocacy that's really focusing on this large-scale clean energy technology with an equity lens. And, you know, offshore wind, for instance, is supposed to be projected to up to 25% of the state of California's future power, so 25 gigawatts. It's a big number, 25 million homes that could be potentially powered by this. And it's a very different aspect of clean energy generation too. Because if you think about the popularity of solar nowadays and how, you know, solar is obviously generated most when the sun is highest, but there's a central question of what do we do when the sun goes down as well. Ocean winds are potentially a complement to that idea of having solar all day long, and then at night having ocean winds really power our grid. So part of it is like we can put up all this clean energy, but Brightline's focus is very specific, is looking at, again, the local communities where this will be primarily sited, so that's the North Coast and Central Coast in California, and ideally creating equitable benefits for them. But embedded in all this work is always, hopefully, a tie to the communities that we are serving and then a sense of community organizing as a skill set unto itself. It's that central question: what does it take to bring people together in a room, and then ideally get them excited about all this too? Here are panels that I will just skim through, but it's the early days of the pandemic and how the work shifted in some ways from these buckets. So there was, for instance, food insecurity work or air quality citing, as, for instance, if you remember the crazy 2020 wildfires that were happening, and then the orange sky that was resulting as a result of that. So part of it was like grappling with, needs in the moment. A lot of our work in San Francisco is around SRO communities, for instance. Let me see a show of hands. I'm very curious. How many people here know what SRO buildings are? Okay, about maybe like a quarter, if that. So SRO buildings stand for single room occupancy buildings. Very particular building stock in San Francisco that's around it's usually for low income to very low income tenants. And the turn of the 20th century, so the 1900s, it was really intended for like a transitional workforce. So a workforce that was moving in and out of a lot of American cities. San Francisco has chosen to maintain its SRO buildings, but there are very unique environmental justice issues with SRO populations. So they range from the older aging conditions of these buildings. So if you think about wildfires, for instance, there's not like a modern HVAC system that's embedded in the SRO building itself, which makes it a challenge. There's also like under, say, a pandemic situation, there is food insecurity concerns because the facilities themselves are shared facilities to begin with, both the bathrooms and the kitchens. So this idea of like, we'll share kitchens was not very popular back in the early days of the pandemic, which is why nonprofits stepped up, like Chinatown Community Development Center, Self-Help for the Elderly. Brightline staff ended up volunteering a lot of time to even deliver food to make sure SRO residents were served. So it just shows you how a lot of it is like trying to meet the moment and ideally, figure out needs that can be served and in the moment when things are happening. I'll end on these last few slides just talking about, again, returning to this idea of graphic storytelling and why even bother with all this at the end of the day. And as I mentioned earlier, my father and mother both individually struggled in their own ways to understand the work that I did. One thing I was always surprised about was how my father connected to art itself. And these are actual art installations you can see in the Richmond district, the west side of the city. These are utility boxes where I drew the image and then they installed it around the box. So my dad, before he went back to South Korea, was looking at these boxes, and it was fascinating to watch him take pictures of it, feel it, to test as if he was testing to see if they were real. And I think a lot about in relation to the environment, what that meant. He can't necessarily see or feel wildfire skies, or at least in his state, could not necessarily do that in this time where he was observing these boxes. This was 2019. So partly art itself, in other words, was more tangible in some ways that my nonprofit work wasn't. He wasn't literally sitting over my shoulder watching me, build community. And then the other thing I was always surprised by too was in those bottom few panels you can see essentially a graduation diploma he got from fellow classmates for graduating from UT, and then he had one of my comic books, my earlier kind of fictional stories I wrote. I was always surprised. I never understood if he really connected to the story itself, but it was also that act of having something tangible to move the pages back and forth and absorb the story on his own kind of time and patience, I guess, at the end of the day. And then here's another kind of example of the art as it goes through varying stages of climate change, but also thinking through how can we represent modern living at the end of the day. I still don't think it's very well understood. On the right-hand side, you can see the makings of what could be a clean energy economy. This is by no means a set vision that's going to happen, but it's happening at least a bit on the East Coast, where in the top right corner you can see, for instance, a manufacturing facility in Providence, Rhode Island, where they're starting to build some of the turbines that are being put up in East Coast states. In the bottom right, you can start to see Paulsboro, New Jersey, that's a port that's represented, as well as even wind blades that are on the port itself, and of course transmission lines. You can build the turbines, but you still need to understand how to port the power to communities that demand it, that want it. I make this joke, kind of in a half joking way, but I think a lot of people nowadays take their power for granted. They think it comes from elves from a wall, essentially. They're not really that connected to the cost of modern living and what it takes to keep everything from your iPhone to nowadays there's a big drive, as you know, between electrifying buildings and transit. So there are like larger contours that we're not thinking about if we don't address the need for clean power generation unto itself. But it's often a compartmentalized discussion too. So in that bottom right, there was a question that being asked on the tour group that I was on in Paulsboro, New Jersey, about like, well, what about wind blades? And you can see in the background, like, oh, there's only big tubes. And the construction site manager at the time literally said, well, don't ask me about questions about blades. We just build a big tube here. So oftentimes our notion, again, right, of power generation, distribution, transmission is often very compartmentalized, perhaps not for the better unto itself. This is, there's two images I'll finally end this on before taking questions. So this is the image I like often comparing to, if you now remember, against the hot air balloon ride, And my father, by the final chapter of the book, has been undergoing dementia. It's still ongoing. It's in many ways like faster than I would have ever expected in the way he's regressed. But part of the challenge has been like trying to jog his memory to some degree, reconnect with him on terms that I'm hoping for. Nowadays he lives in South Korea. The good news is like he has, in some ways, really good medical care to take care of his condition. But as I visit him, it's partly trying to connect some of his earlier memories with my own work. So this is like illustrations of a helicopter ride that I got to go on, a helicopter tour I got to go on, and what was called an accommodations platform near Denmark. It's really around a maintenance of offshore wind turbines. And I was trying to describe to him this work, again, emphasizing perhaps the infrastructure, economic nature of it all. And you can see in the bottom right, like he's in his hospital, and he's just saying, oh, I don't remember any of that. Don't bother me with it, and just go get me a cup of coffee. So I think a lot about the hard, aspects of nonfiction storytelling. For me, as I was drawing this to some degree, I was thinking through, well, will we have our Hallmark movie moment where I'm grasping his hands and he's realizing it's all for something at the end of the day. But part of the challenge at the end of the day is like we often strive, particularly social mission-oriented workers, strive for a sense of legacy. You could say even for a sense of justice. It's hard. Nothing's going to ever work out in the way you want it to be, and that's one of the harder kind of lessons I've learned while doing the work that I do. Advocacy is often, I would say, even thankless, not rewarding unto itself. I think a lot about my grandfather and how when he died, he essentially left a very embittered family behind him. He left and in an effort to explain himself, like how his businesses had failed and he hadn't served his family, he left essentially 15 handwritten pages. And it's a pretty remarkable document. It's all in Korean, and in translating it, it realized like, gosh, there's been a huge scope to his life, but it was all in kind of like a jumble of thoughts that was really hard to connect to. And I'd like to think the book itself is an effort to try to make sense of it all, to ideally do these, whether it's like flashbacks or flash forwards, to connect really around themes of generosity, building community, taking care of one's family. As you ideally try to, I've always loved USF's motto and the feel of its students of being social mission oriented too. There is a history to the school around that. And I'd like to think it's been worthwhile. Maybe we can tease this out more in Q&A later. But yep, that's it for the presentation as of now.
Thank you so much, Eddie. So we're going to open it up for some questions directed towards Eddie's work, any of the words he shared with us today. I know some students from the Environment and Society class have pre-prepared some questions just to maybe start off our discussion. And I'd love it if someone from some of those groups could volunteer to sort of start us off here, or if anyone else has any questions they want to throw out first for Eddie. So we'll go with Sanaya, and then Will, and then Laura.
I have a question about Brightline.
Yes.
Do you guys have like a certain area you focus on with your work?
Yes, I'll go back to that slide earlier, which I went over really quickly. So the buckets again are typically direct service programs, which we often work with other nonprofits in the city with. Some partners to shout out our Community Youth Center, if you happen to know of it, of San Francisco, which is an education services provider. Central City SRO Collaborative, which does a lot of organizing amongst SRO tenants. But we often, and then, even our construction on-ramp program, our job training program, is really done in partnership with 3 other nonprofits spread out across the city. And the reason for that is like recognizing the different neighborhoods. Like oftentimes these organizations are older than Brightline. Like Brightline is relatively young. We're been around since 2006. Really, our more fundamental, campaigns that we're known for weren't around until like 2009, 2010. So it took a long time to ramp us up and then get to the programmatic stage. I would say our newer books of work are probably around things that ideally take advantage of, what was back in, in the last 4 years, a relatively good federal environment, a national drive toward passing, for instance, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is why building decarb, a lot of that work, for instance, is working with other nonprofits to identify resources so that they can rehab their buildings. So that, this work I often describe as like, it's very hands-on. It does require you to be interfacing with the community. This work, theoretically in some ways, can be just done at a computer. At the end of the day, to make it realer though, it does require some interfacing with the communities themselves or other nonprofit workers to even understand what are the needs and how to serve them. So I would say most college students are really interested in policy work at the end of the day. This notion, and I think something else to think about too is like, as I was like talking through, right, my kind of struggle between whether I was going to become a teacher versus a lawyer. I don't think there's a bad path to choose at the end of the day, but I do think there is generally kind of a conceit, if I can even call it that there's this idea that, if only we did enough policy, we could all change the world. I want to really kind of emphasize policy is only one way, and in fact there's a big swath. I mean, in many ways, like economic populism trends that you see today, and even how the country is heavily divided over something like the environment, indicates to you like the very strong limitations of policy. So there has to be some tangible connection to people, communities, as we do it. At least that's been some of the kind of central drives of how Brightline does this work and why. Another question?
Well, you almost just already answered my question. I was just going to ask about policy. What is like maybe one of the most difficult parts that we would necessarily think about when it comes to advocating policies?
I think it's easy in some ways with climate, policy to be seduced, if I can even say that, by the technology itself. Like these structures are, on a technological level, they're incredible. So they are, if you're trying to even scale it for size, a single turbine is the size of the Eiffel Tower. They've also figured out how to make these structures float too. So, and then a single turbine, for instance, can power multiple homes in a single day, like with just one swing of its blades. One message I often emphasize is like, if we could have teched our way out of the climate crisis, we probably would have done so by now. I do think one of the more fundamental challenges with the environment and policy in relation to the environment is really people and how people interact with this stuff. Again, Brightline's focus in all this is equity at the end of the day, trying to look at it from that lens, deliver for local communities. What it often entails is a ton of travel up and down the coast of California. So the reason why I, show this slide with all the coastal communities represented, again, the North Coast, essentially a 7-8 hour drive, north of San Francisco, the Central Coast, 4 or 5 hours, depending how fast you drive from LA or maybe down south from San Francisco. But it's essentially a blended skill set is one way to think about it. It could be, Eddie in a suit and tie, trying to testify before Congress. This is a field hearing in Morro Bay. Or it could be myself in a hoodie sweating it out, trying to do, essentially create a community barbecue with Brightline staff. And I remember at the time how crazy, by the way, this was too. We were serving close to probably 100 people. And then it was myself, 2 other labor leaders, Sarah Shu, even a Brightline. We're helping out to just really get people fed. And I love barbecuing, but I realize I don't love barbecuing for 100 people at a time. It's too stressful. But again, like a lot of it's on-site investigations, trying to make that policy realer, and then building the relationships as you go. Policy work is very much I emphasize, like it's a business of knowing the right people, understanding where the levers are, and ideally trying to figure out how to make communities buy into it all. One other thing I like emphasizing too is in this middle photo, I notice myself eating a burrito. It's my favorite food of choice. But a larger kind of equity-oriented vision for everyone to think about too is that This is a fossil fuel power plant. It's retired in Morro Bay, but part of the vision behind offshore wind ideally is not to rely on fossil fuel power plants in the future too. So as we online these massive, clean technology projects, we would be retiring like the older fossil fuel technology that we've been so reliant on that's causing the climate crisis right now. And maybe one other thing to note too is power plant siting is typically in low-income communities of color. Again, relative to Brightline's history originally in Potrero Hill and Baby Hunters Point and trying to shut the Potrero Hill power plant down.
This is more of like a personal question, but I grew up in Texas also, and I know like the views on environmentalism and policies are like different. So how did growing up there kind of influence your decisions?
Oh. So in Texas, and even in Rhode Island too, when I was going to Brown, one thing that always surprises people is like I did not take an environmental studies course, or I was a political science major with an international relations track. But in a weird way, like I always knew the environment as like a set of challenges that were happening. This is now, I graduated a long time ago, 2001 from high school, 2005 from college. And even then, it was still not well understood. It's only, I would say, Al Gore, as he had lost the 2000 election and then was essentially rediscovering himself as a climate activist. He came out with a documentary, Inconvenient Truth, that really kind of opened my eyes to the idea of even, oh gosh, it's not just about rising sea level, but like hurricanes, for instance, which nowadays we see as like evidence of more climate change accelerating. But it took a long time for me to even reach this idea of like, I like the idea of serving the environment, but again, I came from a very different, I would say more so than Texas as a state. It was really my immigrant family background, which really shaped kind of non-engagement with the environment. It's always like a nice thing to do, but it's never that urgent at the end of the day, to someone like my parents at least. So yeah, the book grapples with that a bit. It's like, I think a lot of people here would agree that ultimately we do feel the climate crisis is urgent and we need to do things to address it, but often it's kind of negotiate the cost of it all, whether it's personal or otherwise societal. Yes, another question.
Thank you, Eddie. It's such a great presentation. So my question is about visual communication and persuasion. So one of the classes that's here is called Multimedia Rhetoric in the Arts. And our last assignment is to create a multimedia, more visually oriented, persuasive experience. So if you were doing something visually and persuasive, what are some things that maybe they could keep in mind in terms of maybe approaches or thinking about communication, visual communication and storytelling as a form of persuasion?
One thing I struggled with a lot was like trying to even translate like my current commissioner experience. So I currently serve on 3 commissions. San Francisco Commission on the Environment, which is all about environmental policymaking in the context of the city and county of San Francisco. The department itself is about 100 staffers dedicated to various things like EV charging infrastructure, zero waste, etc. The second commission is Bay Conservation Development Commission, which is all about shoreline development across the 9 Bay Area counties. One notable example was like when the Oakland A's were trying to propose a new ballpark in West Oakland. That was a big deal before that commission. The final one, which is represented on this page, is about the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, MTC, which is all about transit funding for the 9 Bay Area counties. It's essentially the hub for state and federal dollars and gets it out to local transit agencies like SFMTA, BART, etc. Part of the challenge I often think about in persuasion and visual storytelling is the density of information alone and I just spent like 45 seconds trying to explain all those commissions to you, and I could go on and on and on. But part of the challenge is like a lot of people, to be blunt about it, they don't engage in government at the end of the day. It's often kind of a last minute concern, or sometimes, or I would say a lot of the time, they'll engage in government only when they're mad as hell, right? And they're just like, it's not working for me, what's going on? Let me go, whatever, overturn the system, and it's on its head. So part of it is understanding like there's a lot of infrastructure that's built on government, / taxpayer dollars, and I wanted to visually represent it. You'll notice the text, as much as possible, I try to slim it down. Like I try to retain like key pieces of information, like what is the quantity? and what are the systems even to begin with, and the range of it. I don't try to belabor every point. For instance, I don't try to say, this is SFMTA, the bus system. Like, it's just, there's such a thing as TMI, I think, when you're trying to create, this graphic memoir. I think the challenge I often think about is like, is it enough? And is it sticky? Are the pieces of information I'm picking as a storyteller good enough? And I'll admit up front, I'm imperfect too, as a storyteller. It's a really hard thing to do well. Yes, another question.
Question too. I just was curious also how you came to this medium, amongst other things, and also just to what you just spoke to. Do you have an editor, and is the editor also like, kind of like when we're writing an essay, but like with this different kind of format? How do you work with that editor if you do?
I'll answer the first one. So this is the very first comic I really took pride in right after college. The premise of the story was like a talking turtle, an angry talking turtle, trying to sell coffee across San Francisco. And in many ways, the turtle character was actually inspired by my grandfather again, his failed entrepreneurial ambitions. The turtle, I don't even know if this exists anymore. Like, this is an old sewage pipe that was out on Ocean Beach. And the subtitle is about the avenues, essentially, which is, represented the west side of the city. I have always loved fiction, comics to begin with. I think Brian could easily give you like 100 different recommendations in the genre, in various genres about like what is a good style of graphic storytelling. But I've loved fiction. Part of why I moved into autobiography was just even trying to understand the scope of my own life. This was roughly like, I've done this like 2000, I would say 10 to like 2016, seriously. I did 4 of these kind of fictional stories, and they range. Like, one was about, it's supposed to be in the science fiction genre, where a series of wishes changed the world. But after a while, I was feeling like my own nonprofit work was still chugging along. It was really intense. And then I wanted to try to create something in the style of graphic storytelling that could explain what I was doing to a living, ultimately to my parents, which is why I made the move into autobiography the way I did. So from 2016 to 2020, I drew pages, and I didn't share it with anybody, actually. I was just drawing it for myself as if it was like a journal, essentially. And then I started publishing the first pages on Instagram in February 2020. And then I was surprised, and then a month later, the pandemic happened. In some ways, the pandemic had its own silver linings where all the social events I was going to, even as a nonprofit executive director, they all went away. So all I did was have time to draw. And then I got to build out that Instagram account. An editor, to shift to your second question, at Penguin Random House, eventually landed the book. And in many ways, it sounds like a fairy tale, like, oh, wow, you published this on social media, and then you got discovered by a Big 5 publisher in New York City. For context, the Big 5 are like the publishing system, essentially. They represent 80% of the published book market, so it's a pretty monopolistic system unto itself. But it wasn't an easy process. And part of it is like, I really am grateful to this particular editor, Vedika Khanna, for understanding like even something like this, for instance, if an editor was coming in and saying, oh, I wish like 2 panels were taken out, and then part of the frustration is like, you can only really edit what's essentially a finished product. It's very hard. But also the layout itself can also be totally jumbled up. A lot of this stuff is worked out in my head, and then I layer it on. What's easier, perhaps, is something like this. Like, if you were to replace, say, a particular panel with some kind of nuance, and say, this is not ideal, too, for someone who's essentially an artist and writer in one. But like, hey, can you redraw this to signify something else? Or can you, more subtly, maybe can you change the expression on a character's face to signal, like, this is actually what the story direction is heading in? So I think I had a very understanding editor who understood the labor behind all this, and maybe that's something else to emphasize. Each page in this book is like, so it's 7 to 15 hours of just drawing by hand. It's all hand drawn by, through essentially office pencils, Copic markers, which are like a alcohol-based marker, and technical width and brush pens. And then I scan it in through a scan bed, and then I edit it digitally for another 15 to maybe 20 hours. So each page is roughly like 20 to 30 hours worth of work. The book itself is probably conservatively 5,000 hours worth of work over like a 5-6 year period of intensity. At a certain point, like once the book deal was landed, I was working so much, my hand started disintegrating. Like I was wearing a hand brace because I'm still doing the work at Brightline all day, typing away, whatever, hand motions. And then, going at night and like drawing, frantically to try to meet this deadline of, they wanted 200 pages. So it was very intense to try to meet. But I'm surviving. Yeah. So I'm still alive. I still have my hand. Don't worry.
Beautiful work, thank you.
Yeah. Other thoughts or questions?
Other questions?
I have a question about your parents' liquor store next to the massive liquor store. So what was their strategy? Did they serve different, what was their business model there?
So they didn't choose to compete against the store, just to be clear. When they moved to this shopping plaza, it was essentially a vacant area. There was no other stores in the area. And even in the early days, they had the option of leasing that large liquor store, or that what was essentially an old supermarket that went out of business and bankrupt. But they chose a more modestly sized, like CVS pharmacy style footprint, which is still a big store to begin with. They were like, how can we even fill out like a supermarket just full of alcohol? So they moved into there. Also, Texas has its own kind of weird quirks and alcohol licenses. There are wet counties and dry counties. And a lot of their liquor store business model was about strategically placing their stores in a wet county so that the right customer base would come to it. But, when they were in that space for essentially 1 to 2 years, and the next door was empty, the store did fine. But then what happened was there were separate leases. Without getting too much into it, the gist is like the landlord was pretty ruthless and just let a competitor liquor store right next door when typically there should be like a non-compete clause on something like that. And then as a result, there were like 10 other liquor stores in the county at the time, which was again a wet county. They all closed except for my parents' store because they were locked into their lease. So it was not a good time. It's half jokingly described in the book as like they really emphasize service. So, support the little, in theory, Americans love an underdog story. But the joke perhaps in Texas is like everything is done bigger there too as a state. So anyone coming into the store would look left, see this, little store that my parents had, and then look right and be like, well, I should just go to the bigger store, I guess. So it was a rough go. That liquor store, as I understand, is still existing in the DFW Metroplex. It still remains the largest liquor store in the DFW Metroplex. And my parents survived for about 2 or 3 years before finally closing it down. So at best, you could do a bit of service. There was also like this kind of cloak and dagger game where they would send each other's employees to go check out the merch of the other kind of competitor stores. So they would send employees to my parents' store to see how they were pricing products, and then my parents would also send employees to Goody Goody Liquor to check out how they were pricing merch. But yeah, it was a losing struggle. Other thoughts, questions? Oh wow, cool. Yeah, go ahead.
So you talked about your eye surgery and that experience. So how did that strengthen you and your worldview? And also, you talked about how you kind of lost a passion to create art. So how did you regain that passion?
Maybe to transition from what I was describing. So when I had eye surgery in 2008, I was essentially going through periods of blindness in my right eye. So it was like a curtain just coming down on the right eye, and I couldn't see out of it. Still unexplained to this day. It was like 4 or 5 months of testing, just going through a bunch of different kinds of tests to try to figure out what it was. Part of the challenge was I knew my parents were struggling with their liquor store, and I didn't want to burden them even more with this idea that, God, I have like eye surgery to go through. I still, am in touch with this professor today, Professor John Diamond, who really, pushed me to be like, hey, I know you feel like the filial obligation to, not burden your parents, but, if I was, the parent here, I'd very much want to know. And I think a lot about that. Like, it's a two-way street at the end of the day. It's not. I think the challenge is sometimes like we try to hold stuff in to like love our parents too, and I realized that was an unhealthy dynamic. And I'm really grateful to have an educator and even a friend to push me in a different direction. But yeah, one thing I often describe is like how I've become permanently blind as a result too from that. At the time, it was really tough because law school itself is for people who are interested in law school, just to emphasize, it's not a gentle time. You have a ton of information thrown at you. You are expected to learn around the clock. So for me, like I was just trying to keep my head above water while going to all the medical tests were essentially like a part-time job unto itself as I was like studying at the same time. But I would say like what rekindled my love for drawing, I would say like 2008 to 2010, there are periods of my life where I just didn't draw. Like so 2008 to maybe like 2010, didn't really draw up until those Turtle comics where I was like getting back on the horse. Another kind of period where I didn't draw was when I was just taking over Brightline to 2015 to like 2017. Those days I was working like 120 hour work weeks and just really burnt out just doing the nonprofit work itself. I loved the nonprofit work, which is why in some ways I didn't mind taking a break from drawing. But I've always thought it fills a very different side of my head. It helps me work through it. Maybe it's like a cheaper form of therapy because all I need is like a pencil at the end of the day to doodle something. But yeah, I think it's probably what lets me return to it over and over is that I really like this idea of coming back to just a sheet of paper on a desk and working out thoughts, whether it's through fiction or nonfiction, through this idea of graphic storytelling. And maybe one other personality trait that people are usually surprised to find out about me is I do consider myself a core introvert at the end of the day. I have a huge social battery for meeting people. I'll enjoy meeting you all after this event too. I don't want you to feel, like you have to hold back. But at the same time, like I need to go home and recharge as well. So drawing, in some ways, art has offered that respite, that ability to recharge. There was a bunch of questions here.
Actually,
oh yes.
Unfortunately, at the time, it
yes.
is 6 o'clock,
6.
just about. But maybe you can stick around for
Yeah,
a few minutes.
totally.
And I don't know if this room is occupied right after 6, but we could always, we do have some desserts and things probably still waiting for us out here. I'll just take this opportunity to thank Eddie for joining us today. Time always slips by so fast. Just a couple of other things, before we formally end. I just actually wanted to thank Eddie because Eddie has been such a champion of our students here at USF for many years now, especially in environmental studies and science. He mentors our students, he hires our students, as we have a couple of these students here, and they've gone off to do amazing things beyond USF. So thank you so much, Eddie, for always believing in our students and continuing to mentor them. 2 other things I want to say before we take off here. Please take a look at Eddie's books here. We're selling them. I'm sure he can sign, some books for those of you who are interested. And then the last thing is, if you are in my class, please make sure you sign in before you take off for the rest of the day. And the other thing is, Eddie's work will be, along with other comic book artists, on display as part of the Long Distance Relationship Asian American Comics Artists and the Complexities of Connecting in Thacher until November 10th. So if you haven't gotten a chance to check that artwork out, please do so. You have a few more days. That's it. Thank you so much.